I need to care less because then I can be better at my job. And it's like, you don't need to not care at all. Sometimes it's just that like a small adjustment where you bring that into a better balance.
You're in the UK, right?
I am, yeah. Where are you in the States?
I'm in New York.
Nice. One of my favorite places.
Yeah, you've been here?
Yeah, a couple of times actually, but not for a long period of time, or just kind of passing. And I did a long weekend there, but we went over to California first and then did New York on the way back. And we did New York on the way back from Hawaii, which was nice. But yeah,
Oh, nice.
nice, nice place.
It's a beautiful place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. What's your current feel on New York or California or Hawaii? Like, what is that? What's the thought there?
What in general, what's happening in your country? Or
That's a whole different can of worms. But I mean, let's go historically back to when you were here. When you were here.
What did you mean? Sort of what did you mean specifically?
I'm saying, like, from your perspective, what was your experience like coming over here? Was it what you expected it to be, or different?
So I'll be totally honest. The first time I came over, I didn't think I was going to like it, and I was surprised at how much I did because it's a very fast paced place, isn't it? Like people
Yes.
don't wander. They very purposeful, very intentional, A to B. But no, I really liked it. The people were great.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've never been to the UK. It's definitely on my list of places to
Ah,
visit.
okay. Anywhere in particular?
No, I honestly literally know next to nothing about it at all, to be totally honest. But I'm a big fan of travel and experiencing new places, meeting new
Yeah.
people. I feel like when you go different places, you get to experience different cultures, different communities, and you learn a lot about them. And I think one of the cooler parts is you kind of find out that even though it looks and feels a little bit different, it's really all the same. Like, I think, and that's a lesson I think a lot of people could learn, is that, like, just because you have this idea of what it looks like and it sounds different or it looks different,
Yeah.
it's really like everyone has the same daily struggles. Like, we all do the same stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, we're not as divided as I think people like make out. But I think that the thing with the UK as an American is that what we think is like, oh God, that's like the other side of the country, whereas you guys do 6-hour road trips and think nothing of it. So you can tour around the UK. I think Americans travel like you'll come to the UK and then you'll travel right the way around because for
Yeah.
you, like going from one side to the other is like half a state, whereas for us it's
Right.
a much much bigger thing. So yeah, they're good places to visit and actually can be very different in terms of geography and culture and things like that. So it's worth traveling around a little bit.
Yeah. Now, to fast forward a second to where we are at today, and like just the current geopolitical climate of there's seems like there's a lot of tension, obviously, right? And everyone is kind of like a little on edge and a little nervous. But I think a lot of it has to do with literally just what we talked about, how there are people who are just kind of hyping it up because they'll make money off of hyping it
Yeah,
up. But it's really not that much different than,
fear sells
right?
well, right?
Yeah. So, I'm curious kind of your take on all that and, how I think a lot of it relates back to leadership and to understanding community and culture. And I'm kind of just curious on what your thoughts are on just all of it in general and kind of how it relates back to that leadership topic.
I mean, it is a huge topic. I think it's just really sad. It feels like it's undoing lots of things that people have worked really hard to do. I don't know. I think it's one of those things that I think if you how deep you dig into it of what you read in the mainstream media versus the experience of people day to day. I think there's a lot, and like you said, fear sells. People make a lot of money in a crisis, in chaos, and I think I think it's difficult to see. I think it's a very worrying time for people. I don't think we can dismiss that. I think it's a very real very real concerns, very real fears for a lot of people. And then I think there'll be also some people that will sail through and feel very unaffected by it all. And I think that's hard to see. It's very difficult from the outside looking in. And I don't think the UK is particularly, we tend to follow where the US goes. So I think there's people here that will have similar concerns as to what happens here. But I think it depends which lens you look at it through. But I think from a leadership perspective, interestingly, I do lots of different work with global organizations. So quite often there's people in the room from different countries, different cultures, different languages. But actually, when it comes down to it, the leadership challenges are the same, because people are people, aren't they? Where, and the challenges are often the same. So, I think treating people as individuals and looking at what each individual needs, I would argue, has always been a key requirement from a good leader. I think now more than ever, it's really important just to really listen in and hear what people have got to say and what their concerns are and how things impact them, and not to be too dismissive over it. I think, I've just had a client session now, and their company's going through a period of change, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And as a leader, they want to be positive, they want to encourage their team, they want to bring them through it. But at the same time, we can't leap to the positive thinking too quickly, because we need to hear people and we need to listen to their concerns, and they need to feel heard. And we don't want to be so quick to be positive that we end up dismissing, what's a real worry for people. So there's a lot going on right now.
Yeah. Well, I think it gives people sort of an opportunity to shift the power dynamic. For a lot of people who have been very passive in letting other people dictate where their life goes, I think the opportunity, right, because in every scenario, there's either you can look at the opportunity or the fear part of it. And I think what I'm seeing right now, at least personally, is there is tremendous opportunity here for people to step up and kind of reclaim their own power and say, hey, I'm not just going to let all the noise going on outside affect me. I'm going to start taking control over my own life, and we're going to lead it in a proper way. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity there for individual people to kind of step into their actual power. Right? Do you see that same opportunity?
Absolutely. And I would always argue that, where there's chaos, there's opportunity. A good friend that I work with quite often, one of his favorite sayings is, mindset is everything and opportunity is everywhere. So I think, as I've just been talking about with my client, I think we can look for those opportunities, even when it feels very chaotic, even when there's lots of uncertainty, and we can look to see, we might not be able to control what's happening, but we can control how we respond to it, and we can control how we choose to feel about it. And understandably, there'll be lots of people who will feel angry and who will feel frustrated. That drives, those are emotions that drive action. And I think when we work through those emotions and we channel those emotions in a way that means that we take action that seizes those opportunities, that can be really powerful. So it's just how we manage that, how we respond to it, and how we choose to respond rather than react. I think that's the biggest thing. I think if we react through the emotions, then that can have a very different outcome to when we choose how to respond by being informed by the emotions, but not reacting to them, by having a more considered response about the long-term impact and the consequences of actions. And actually that can be a real positive. So I think these emotions that people are feeling can feel very uncomfortable because we're not used to feeling them. We don't like to feel them, but actually that can drive real action. And sometimes people need to be pushed to that level of emotion to be able to feel that they've got that energy and that need to respond to things in a different way.
Yeah. I think you touched on a good point there, is we can't not feel the emotions. So I think that there's two different extremes going on right now, where there's people who are just not feeling anything, and there are people who are feeling everything and letting those feelings dictate their decisions. Right? I think the best play there, and obviously it takes a little bit of self-work to get to the point where you can do this, but to feel the feeling, really understand it, and then make a decision, not based on just like the rage of the feeling, but hey, I've taken in all the information. Let's make the best decision on what's best for me and my family or me and my business. Right? Is it the same? Am I on the right track
Yeah,
there?
I think so. And I would say that neither of those extremes are healthy. Yeah, I think the denial and switching off and not feeling anything at all isn't healthy in the same way that feeling everything and being driven and living through those emotions is not healthy either. I think being able to recognize what those emotions are. I mean, emotions for me are they're like a warning system. I describe it like it's like the engine light in your car. It tells you that there's something you need to pay attention to. And I think our emotions tell us that something is important and we do need to pay attention to it. We can't ignore it because ultimately it's the same as trying to ignore the red light on your car. Eventually it's just going to come up and it's going to keep coming up in different places until you have to pay attention to it. And for some people that becomes chronic illnesses. If they don't deal with what's going on under the surface, eventually it comes to the surface and forces us to deal with it. So I don't think the denial and the switch off is healthy either. So there is a sweet spot, like you said, where we can sit and listen to what those emotions are telling us and then work off that information rather than the emotion itself.
Yeah. One of the best analogies I heard about that recently was to use dials, not switches.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about a switchboard where you're either turning switches on or off, or you have a dial which you can kind of adjust the intensity from 0 to 100.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's going to be 2%, sometimes it's going to be 100%, right? But you can modulate it a little bit easier. And I think there's a lot of people who are operating on switches right now,
Mm-hmm.
where we're just either on or off. And it causes this very chaotic up and down scenario where I think it becomes really difficult to lead yourself in that situation where, you're all over the place.
Yeah, I'm going to use the analogy of the dimmer switch, like the light
Yeah.
dimmer switches. And often it's a question that I'll ask people is that if you could turn it down by one, how would that feel different for you without actually having any impact on anyone else? And quite often, I think, for leaders as well, sometimes I hear leaders say, I care too much. I need to care less because then I can be better at my job. And it's like, you don't need to not care at all. Sometimes it's just that like a small adjustment where you bring that into a better balance. That means people don't see that you're caring less, but actually you're just bringing it into a place where it feels healthier for you, that allows you to switch off when you go home and you're not thinking about these things at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I think the dial is a great analogy. And I think with any of our behaviors, with any of our attributes, with all of these things, that is the balance, isn't it? Of finding, with
Yeah.
some people, we can turn some of our characteristics and our attributes right up. And with some people, we need to dial it down a little bit to bring it into balance for the situation that we're in or the people that we're with. So I think so much of life is around that sweet spot of the dimmer switch. And I use this with, talking about bass. If you think about the dial on the bass in music, there are some songs, there are some music tracks or some genres of music where you can bring that bass right up and it makes the music sound fantastic. But other music, if you're listening to a playlist on shuffle and then that next music track comes in and the bass is too much and it distorts it and it's not great. So I think it's a great analogy to think of, actually sometimes we need to turn it up and sometimes we need to turn it down, but it's different with different situations and with different people. But it is about finding that balance and finding that sweet spot.
Yeah. I want to challenge the idea a little bit of caring too much, because I don't know that as a leader you can care too much. I think where the difference comes in is allowing the caring to dictate the decision.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So is that really the fine point there? Is it's not that you're caring too much, but you're allowing the fact that you care to change the decisions that you're making.
Yeah. And I think that's what people will say is, I care too much. I feel like I need to care less, because they're feeling all of those emotions. And people don't, I think leaders don't always just feel their own emotions. They're feeling the emotions of their team as well, especially when they're an empath. So not only are they trying to work through their own emotions on a change or a situation, they're also trying to understand and manage and support the emotions of their team as well. And that can be really, really varied. So I think sometimes it's that taking on of the emotions rather than taking on the information that the emotions are telling them. So it's the that collective of emotions quite often has a theme of this is what's important to us. We feel all of these different emotions because 10 different people will feel 10 different ways about one thing, but actually all of those emotions quite often has one message behind it, or we all care this in this way because this is what's important to us. And I think that as the leader, as the manager, that's the bit of information you're trying to elicit from your team is, okay, they feel all of these things, but what is it that's important to them? Why are they having these strong emotional responses? What's the information telling me? And that's the bit that I can then take away and help support and influence and guide and be able to lead them through. And I don't think it's caring too much. I don't think you can care too much. I think it's more perhaps the way and the balance for them in being able to manage it themselves, that it doesn't become too heavy and too much for them to be able to still be a manager and a leader in the process.
So what about the idea of being able to do the work on yourself first to kind of silence your own emotional noise, where then you have capacity to deal with the other stuff, right? Because I think one of the things I see a lot is leaders who have their own whole mess of things going on, where they haven't done the self-work to kind of figure out their own emotional health. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have stuff going on, because we all have stuff going on, but to be able to figure out the ways and means to handle your own emotions and your own day-to-day stuff, so that you have capacity to feel the other emotions, right? Because I think that there's a lot of people who are going around who have not done that self-work yet, who don't have the capacity to listen to other people, to feel other people's feelings. And what winds up happening is, because we have such little capacity in these relationships, we explode, right? We boil over way too fast. And then we're overstimulated, we're arguing with each other. And I think that it comes back to kind of us taking care of ourselves first, to show up as that leader, right? I think the first thing we have to do before we can lead other people is lead ourselves. Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's similar to parenting, isn't it? We need to, sometimes as a parent, we feel a certain way in response to how our children behave, and we have to hold on to that to be able to respond in a way that supports them as individuals. And I think, that certainly for me, both as a parent and as a leader, that has been a key thing for me is, okay, I feel a certain way, but that's how I feel about this situation isn't going to help us to resolve this situation. So I need to self-regulate, and I need to put how I feel about it to one side. Otherwise, they don't come and tell you anything, or they don't share with you how they feel, because then they're worrying about how you feel about it and how you respond to it. And I think that's one of the things that quite often comes up in coaching. Is people say that this is a space where they can speak very freely and without worrying about how I feel, what my perception is, any judgment, or I don't have an emotional response to what they're sharing. So it means it then becomes a very safe space for them to be able to share very openly and not feel they have to filter because they're trying to protect my feelings, or they're trying to protect themselves from my emotional response. So I think management is exactly the same. A good leader is able to separate, this is how I feel about this as an individual versus how the emotional or regulated state that I need to be in to be able to support my team and to be able to create that safe space for them. We talk about psychological safety. It's that, how do I create a safe space for my team to be able to speak openly and share and talk things through, so that I'm in a position where I can lead and guide and listen and support without influencing or trying to control how they feel and what they do next.
And that's not something that you can just turn on, right? That's something that you have to build over time. You have to build up that feeling of trust and safety with your team, where they feel like, hey, I understand based on, months or years of how you interact with me, this is how this is going to go.
Yeah, and it's the small stuff that counts. It's the I think the for me it's the consistency and being regular, the regularity of being good with the small stuff. So if they come to you with something small and you give them that time, you give them that space, you give them, you listen and you support them with the small things, they're going to trust you with the big stuff. But you do have to earn that. You can't just command that because you're in a position of responsibility. It's not, I think it's how it might have worked in the past. My background's in the police. I think probably historically you commanded that respect because of the hierarchy and the ranking that is there to a certain point. But the leadership is changing, and certainly younger generations, they're not looking for a leader that commands respect. They're looking for a leader that earns their respect. And I think that's really important of how we learn how to do that. And it is a learned behavior. So, if people are struggling with that, it is something that they can learn. It is something that they can practice. But it is very intentional. You don't just happen upon it. It's just something that you have to work on. And I think if you want a team that checks in with you, and you want a team that can come to you and speak openly and freely, you have to give them that space on the very small stuff to be able to build that trust and that rapport for the bigger things that happen. And that will, I think, naturally, that does happen over time. I think good leaders are able to do that very quickly, very efficiently, by being there for the small things and being consistent and being somebody that they just know where they're at with that person, rather than the emotional irregulation of, I don't know who's showing up today, and I don't know if I can go and knock on their door today. Maybe I'll leave it till tomorrow. When you've got that consistent, calm, regulated leader, that builds trust and rapport, and I think that's what people want to see.
I agree. Do you think that there's a similarity between leader to employee and parent to child in those terms of like those relationships?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of similarities, and certainly in coaching sessions, I'll work with people who are both, they'll be both a leader and a parent. And quite often, we can come out of the leadership scenario and talk about a parenting scenario in an analogy to help them to understand how the dynamic works. I think there's a lot around it. And I think one of the analogies that I use more often than not that brings parenting into leadership is that patience to be able to stand back and allow your team to learn and to make mistakes and to be slow and to find their way of doing things. And I think that's exactly the same as parenting a young person into their teens, into being a young adult. In their early years as a child, we're showing them how to do it. We're teaching them, that role as a parent is very much around, this is how I would do it, so this is how you should do it too. And then when we get to the teens, it's more about, okay, well, this is how I would do it. How do you think you need to do it? And helping them to learn how to make those decisions, helping them to learn how to deal with the world, how to make those decisions, and how to deal with the consequences from those decisions. That's how they build that resilience. That's how they put tools in their toolkit that help them as a young adult. And it's the same in a workplace. As leaders, it's very easy. You want to jump in and you want to fix because you know how and you've done it before. And it's just much easier if I just do this for you. But unless we give people that space to learn and make mistakes and learn how to make those decisions and work out the consequences, it's going to be no different to a parent that gets impatient with a child who's learning to tie their shoes. If we don't ever take that step back and go through the pain of our young children learning how to tie their shoes, we would be tying the shoes of our 20-year-olds. So we have to go through that for them to be able to do what they need to do. And it's the same in leadership. It is easier to jump in and do it, but that helps you and it doesn't help them. So it just prolongs the pain. It's very similar.
Yeah. Well, I think the question then becomes like, how do you manage the timelines of that? Because if you look at our example here, let's say for the first 8 years of a kid's life, they don't know how to tie their shoes. Okay, and whatever age you learn to tie your shoes is relevant, but let's, for now, say 8 years. If it takes you 8 years of showing someone how to tie their shoes, which is a relatively simple task, you can't then say, I'm okay with allowing my employee at work to take 8 years to learn this task that they're given, right? So obviously there's a little bit of a difference here when it comes to, right, if they come in with some experience, they should be able to pick up these things faster. Does it become 8 weeks, 8 days? Like, how do we manage that expectation in these relationships?
I think that communication is always going to be important. And I think the expectation of those timelines being communicated early on is really important. I think also this is where it comes down to the recruitment of the skills and the recruitment of the behavior skills that come with them. So I'm hearing a lot of leaders now talking about how they'll recruit to behavior skills above the technical skills, because the technical skills are much quicker to teach and for people to learn than the behavior skills. So if we use the analogy of tying the shoes, if you've got two candidates and one is getting close to being able to tie their shoes, but they moan about it, they're not willing to try, and they're going to ask you every single time, and you've got a second candidate that's close to tying their shoes but is really keen to learn and wants to be able to do it in the next week, which candidate you're picking. And I think the behavior skills will quite often peak, go over and above the technical skills. But I think the communication of the expectations and those timelines is really important. But, I think also making sure that they've got the resources in place to be able to support them to be able to do that, and asking them what they need to be able to meet those expectations and those deadlines.
Yeah, I love that example. And here's what it makes me think of, which I think is a great follow-up question that ties this all together. If I'm looking at this from a business perspective, I obviously want to hire the person with, the second person who is eager to learn, who's excited, who's motivated. To me, that comes from how they are raised as a kid. So the way that I see this is the parent-child relationship. If from the time that child is very young, you as a parent are actively pouring into them, encouraging them, motivating them to do these things, they're going to be a very different grown-up than if you are constantly belittling them, telling them they're stupid, they don't know how to tie their shoes, they're blah, 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 right? You're talking down to the kid. So I think the thought process here is, does that child's success in the workplace in the future start with the relationship that they have parent to child as a kid?
I think it starts there. I don't think it ends there. So I think what we're talking about, we're talking growth mindset, aren't we? So I think, again, even if a young person hasn't had a great start and hasn't had that encouragement, they are going to have those beliefs. They are going to have a mindset that they've learned. But I think that can be changed. If that person recognizes that it is changeable, and they have that support in place, that people that are willing to put in that energy alongside them to be able to create that change, I think it can be. I've seen enough and worked with enough young people to see, actually you can change it quite quickly as well. When that child is willing to learn and wants things to be different, and you put the right people in that room with them, things can change really, really quickly. So I think it does start with, and we know that those early formative years can be life-changing. I don't think it's the full stop. I think there's enough that we can do that gives them that support. And I think sport is a great way of doing that. I think sport is a huge, we get young people that come up through the system and they come into sport, and sport challenges that. Sport challenges their way of thinking. It challenges, what boundaries mean, what discipline means, what showing up means, what putting in the work means. And I think, we know that sport is a life changing for a lot of young kids, as well as other hobbies, because it puts them in an environment where they're with people who think differently, who act differently. And we know that that's really powerful. We are the result of who we surround ourselves with, right? So, if we surround ourselves, it's not necessarily in our control in our formative years. We can't control who we surround ourselves with, but we can we can have some change and some influence over that in those teen years. So I think, there's lots of things out there that when we start to put people in a different environment, the things can change quite quickly. So yeah, I think it starts with the parents, but I don't think it ends there.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, to even continue to draw that parallel, it really, like, if we're looking at the formative years of a child's life versus the formative years of a young employee's life, it comes down to us as a leader willing to go first, to give them a little bit of grace and space, to set the standard for what we expect, and to show the standard for what we expect. Right? Because I think that there's a very big difference there between leaders, or alleged leaders in that scenario, who are going to say, hey, this is the standard I expect, but they don't live that standard out every day. Right? And I think that builds a lot of trust when you can not only say the standard, but show the standard in how you live.
Yeah. It's the same for parents, the same for coaches and teachers, and the same for leaders too. People mirror the behavior that they see, not necessarily listen to the words that they hear. So we can say all of the right things, but if our behavior is teaching them something completely different, then that's what they're going to learn. So I think you're absolutely right. As leaders, we need to model the behavior that we want to see in our team. So we have to demonstrate that. And when you look from a culture perspective, we know that culture, we can design culture, but culture can also happen by default. So if everybody is showing up and behaving in a certain way, that's what's going to create the culture. So we need people to, not necessarily just leaders when it comes to shaping culture. We need people to show up and behave in a way that we want everyone to behave for the outcome that we're looking for. But it quite often, because leaders hold those positions of influence and people are looking at them to lead by example, that's why that responsibility is often looked at for them. Although it is everybody's responsibility, we look at our leaders to lead and to lead by example. Would you agree?
Yeah. I think it does, if we tie this back to how this conversation started with where we're at in the world, it gives us an opportunity as regular people. We are not in quote unquote leadership positions at the global scale, not that I know of. But if we step up and say, hey, this is right, this is wrong, I'm going to show you by example how we treat people in our community, how we treat our neighbors. Like, hey, if we stand up and go first, we can start shifting that culture. And I think that's where the responsibility comes, not to just be part of an angry mob, but to say, hey, we're going to have a civil conversation. We're going to do this the right way. And we are going to move our society forward together as human beings, because again, we are all pretty much the same if we just are willing to sit and have some conversation.
Yeah. And listen in those conversations, and I think that's the circle of influence. We all have a circle of influence. We might not have a global scale circle of influence, but we do have a circle of influence in terms of who we spend our time with, who we work with, who we engage with, and we hold responsibility for how people are impacted in our circle of influence. And I think we can definitely use that, and I think we can use that better. I think we can be more aware of that, because as we said at the beginning, there's very genuine fear out there in terms of what's happening on a global scale, but on a day-to-day life scale, we can alleviate some of that fear by the way that we interact and the way that we engage with people, and show that there is a that society and that feeling of community and that feeling of support is there. But I think we need to almost be more proactive now in how we show it. We can't just assume that people feel that. I think we have to kind of be that little bit extra with those behaviors for people to be able to see it and feel it. And certainly, certain people in marginalized communities, they need to see that more than ever to kind of counteract some of the things that they are. I don't think it's necessarily going to take it away, but I think if they can see that on a daily basis and they can see that people are, we're all looking out for each other, I think that can go a long way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think ultimately it all boils down to people who don't feel loved, appreciated, seen, and heard in their current environment, right? When you don't feel those four things, you just feel fear. You feel insignificant. You feel, you don't know who you are. You just feel like you're shrinking down until ultimately the point you disappear.
Yeah.
And I think for us to be able to show up and say, hey, I see you. I don't necessarily have to agree with you. I'm not saying I condone everything you do, but I'm willing to sit and listen, and we'll talk about it. We'll find a common middle ground that works for you, works for me, and we can both live our lives. But I think we're spending too much time trying to force our belief systems on other people rather than just understanding what's important to them and letting them live their best life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we also need to step outside of our echo chambers a little bit. I think that it's a safe space to be, isn't it? If we sit and talk to people who agree with us and sound like us and have the same perspective as us, but actually it's a pretty dull place to be too. I think there's a lot to learn, and I think there's a lot of value in sitting with people who see the world differently. And I think when you take off the table trying to get them to see it your way, and you sit at the table to try and see it from their viewpoint, it just shifts the conversations. And I think we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from other people. I think people are missing out.
But they are tremendously, because I think it has to do with removing the expectation of what you're going to get out of that interaction. Right? Are you going into that saying, I'm going to have this conversation because I want to prove myself right and that person wrong and change their mind? Or am I going with it an open mindset where I can just listen to them? Hey, maybe I'll learn something. Maybe they'll learn something. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn for sure. You need to leave the ego at the door, right? Because we don't know everything, and we don't know better. We know different, and those things will be shaped by our own experiences. I think that's always the interesting question for me, is when somebody does hold that different perspective, is asking questions, and coming at it with that childlike curiosity of, okay, why? Why do you think that? What experiences have you had in your life that has helped to shape this world viewpoint? And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with it, but it does mean that you'll understand it that little bit more. And when it comes down to humans, when it gets to that very core, basic, fundamental level, we all have the same psychological, emotional, and physical needs. So it's just the surface level that looks a little bit different. But the more you peel back those layers, it's exactly the same underneath.
Yeah. And you start to really get that perspective where you understand, like, this person's acting in this way because of this reason. And, I think if you're able to look at it from their perspective and say, hey, if I was in that situation, what would I do? What would I feel? I think a lot of times we realize, like, it makes sense to them.
Yeah.
Or it might not make sense to us because we have a different life experience. Yeah. And it's difficult, I think, especially as a leader. You're expected to sort of be the one with the answers, right? And I almost think you have to come in with a little bit of self-confidence that can often be misconstrued as ego and pride, right? Where you're expected to be the person who, right, as a leader, you hire the very best people to do the job, right? You hire the expert at this category, the expert at that category. And what ultimately happens when you hire the expert at all these categories and they don't know the answer, they come back to you, right? So you're sort of assumed to be the expert at everything, which is impossible. But I think there's a lot of leaders who don't understand you can't come at it with ego and pride. It won't work. You have to put the ego down and say, hey, I don't know the answer, but let's find out, right? They're not expecting the answer. They're expecting someone to help find the answer with some level of authority.
Yeah. I think I would love to hear more leaders say that with confidence. I don't know. Let's go and find out. I think there's so much more that goes wrong when people try to make out that they know, rather than just saying, I don't know. Let's see what we can find out. Let's go and find the information that we need to help us to make that answer. But I think also, it's understanding when there's good intentions and unintended consequences. So sometimes people, within your team will go about and do something, they'll make a decision or they'll take an action, and you can look at that as a leader and think, what were they thinking? Because now you've got the bigger picture, you've got the benefit of hindsight, you can see what happened, but that wasn't the situation they were in when they made that decision. And I think as a leader, asking those curious questions, okay, what what was the information you had when you made that decision? What options did you consider? What was your thought process? Because you can't make that judgment. Again, ego and pride take it off the table. Rather than making a judgment on the consequences, sit and have that conversation around what was the good intention that led to the unintended consequences, and help them to walk back through that process, because that's where they're going to learn, rather than you walking in and saying, well, that's not what I would have done. And your ego and your ability and your experience to say, well, I would have done something different and something better. Even as leaders, we've made multiple mistakes over time. We just prefer not to remember them. But, actually sitting down with people and having that conversation, open curiosity of how did they reach that decision, and help them to walk through it. That's where their learning happens. And that's what's going to help them to make a better decision next time. Might still not be the right decision, but it'll be a better one.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing you say there is it's sort of a shift in the mindset of the leader, and not that they're expected to have the answer, but they're expected to get the answer. I think it's a really small shift. Mm-hmm. But like, if the determination is not, I'm going to come to you because I know you're going to have the right answer, but I'm going to come to you as a leader because I know our interaction will lead to the answer. And I think that little shift, even though it's tiny, takes the pressure off the leader to always have the answer, but puts the pressure on them to go and find it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the shift that helps us show up better as leaders. We're not expected to just, Google the answer in our head in 2 seconds and then just give you everything we know.
Yeah.
We can't do it.
I think it's the three things for me. You're there to lead, you're there to guide, and you're there to support. You're not there as the font of all knowledge and the oracle in the company of having all of the answers. That doesn't exist. And I would say the same, to other leaders when I was in the police. I said, I've been here 20 years. I've worked in various departments. I know a lot about what there is to know, but I'm never going to know everything. And when I think I know everything, something changes. The law changes, the legislation changes, the policy changes, the guidance changes, people change. So you are never going to know all that there is to know. And the sooner you accept that, the better manager you'll be, the better leader you'll be, because you'll be there to support, to guide, and to lead. You won't be there thinking that you have to have the right answer every single time for every single thing that happens. It's just not a realistic expectation. Whereas actually, what do people want from their leaders? They want to lead, they want them to guide, and they want them to be supportive. It's the easy bit.
Yeah.
Or easier.
I was going to ask you what you think the best step forward for a leader to be the best leader would be, but I'm pretty sure you literally just answered that question before I even asked it. So, any other thoughts on that? Because I honestly think showing up as a leader who leads, supports, and really just hears people out is the best possible way you can lead.
Yeah, I think so. I think leadership, I don't think leadership is changing. I think it's evolving. I think what people want from leaders is changing with the younger generations coming through, because they want something different from life in general. So I think, if we focus on leading, guiding, and supporting, that's still going to be very individual to every individual. It's going to look different, how people want to be led, how they want to be supported, how they want to be guided. In the same way as parenting, if you have more than one child, how you show up as a parent is going to be different for more than one. You'll have one child and you think, I've nailed it, this is how parenting is, and then you have the second child and you realize that they need you to be a completely different parent for them. That's why I stopped at one. This is the same with leadership. You might have 10 people in your team and they all need you to show up in a different way to get the best out of them. And that's what leadership is for me. It's about getting the best out of each individual, helping them to show up and be the best version of themselves, as that's what helps them to stay. And it's also what helps them to be a high performing team, which ultimately as a leader, that's what you want.
Yeah. And I think it's important to understand that, like, it doesn't make you a different person to everybody. Like, you still have to have the same set of core values, mm-hmm. but just sort of adapt those to each situation, each person differently. Like, the analogy it makes me think of is gardening. Like, if you're growing a garden, you're going to have to care for The carrots, very different than you're going to have to care for the strawberries. They're going to require a little bit of different care, but there's still a core value of, hey, I want to keep the rabbits out of my garden. I want to make sure I water it every day. Like, there's some core values that have to be there, but the individualized, attention to detail for each specific plant or person is going to be very different.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
I want to thank you for this conversation, this time. It has been a true pleasure, and I do hope that one day we can share a conversation in person, whether that's on this side of the pond or that side.
A good British tea and a scone.
Sounds
It was
like a
nice
plan.
to meet you. Thank you very much for having me.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you.